Alright, so if you watched the video number 6, then you would now know how to HTTP post data to the server, which the server can then save in an array, in a database, in some other way of saving it. There's many different ways. But before you send data to the server, you need to make sure it's good data, because you don't want to pollute your data, your server. You don't want to pollute your server with bad data, because that's going to turn your website into crap. Like, any form you fill out always checks online. Any form you fill out online always checks what you're submitting to make sure it's legit. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to do that. And not only am I going to show you how to do a simple HTML JavaScript front-end validation, I'm going to show you on the back end as well to make sure the data coming in is also good. In general, when you want to make a web app like this that has a front end and a back end, you want to validate your data on both the front end and the back end. Because if you saw my last video about Postman, anyone could use Postman, not just you. Anyone can use it to hit your API routes, and they can totally bypass your front end validation. The front end validation is really just a helper. It'll all make sense soon. So let's just dive into it. Let's do something. Okay, so right now the problem with Mittens is that I can click submit right here, and it gets posted to the server just fine, and it comes out as a blank meow. So let's try that again. Close that, submit, and there we go. I can submit a whole bunch of blank meows. So for our front and back end validation, we want to make sure that there's actual text. Let's make sure it's actually like 5 characters long, just to make sure. So let me do this. Let me make sure what's in this box is at least 5 characters before we submit it. So one way we can do that is in our index.html. When you do submit new meow, when you click the submit button, we can do some quick JavaScript string length testing on this scope variable new meow. So let's do that first. I'll say if scope.newMeow.length is less than 5 characters long, then return, which means exit the function. Don't attempt to post it to the backend, just return. But not only that, but I'm also going to return an alert so that you know that there's something wrong. I'll say alert meow must be 5 chars. So let's try this on for size. Refresh, and let's just say A. Submit, and there we go. Meow must be 5 chars, and let's do 5 A's. 2, 3, 4, 5. Submit, and there we go. It went through just fine. So this is all fine and dandy. This is a front-end validation, but the problem is that we have no back-end validation. So anyone could basically go to your website. They can right-click, view page source. You can do some minification of your code. There's some tools out there, but it still doesn't fully fix the problem, because anyone could look at your code here, whether it's in the main file or it's in a JavaScript file. They'll still see it. As long as their browser can see it, they can see it. And they can see what your API route is. So they can directly, using Postman, submit to your API route and totally bypass that JavaScript thing that we just added. So let me show you how to do that. You can open Postman. I think it's in the apps. Where are the apps? Maps. Is it installed? Postman, here we go. Okay, so let's open our Postman. If you remember from the last video, we saved a bunch of requests. So submit new meow, body. Let's make this just like before. Let me just put an A. So that's clearly not long enough. And let's submit this to the server right now. Send. There we go. A was added. And if you go to our website and refresh it, there we go. You have the A meow, and which is clearly not long enough. So again, anyone can look at your code. Anyone can bypass it somehow. And it might not even be intentional too. Sometimes someone will have a browser that might have a weird bug in it. There's tons of browsers out there. Most people just use Chrome and Firefox, Internet Explorer, but there's some weird gotchas between browsers, and one of them might not, your form validation scheme might not work for whatever reason. So you always want to do something else. So let's show you how to do that now. So on the back end here in server.js, let's do, before we insert this new meow into the meows collection, let's do some same exact thing we did on the front end. If rec.body.new meow length is less than 5, you're not going to just return like you can on the front end, because it's a little more complicated here. You have to actually return a res.status of 400, which is an error. Usually 200 means it's a success. If you do res.send, it's automatically 200. So if you want to do an error, you have to set res.status 400 and then .send a message like not long enough. So let's save that. Let me just make sure I did that right. Send. Okay. So let's go back to our postman here. By the way, I'm using nodemon, which automatically restarts your server anytime you make changes. So it's a really nifty tool. Just do npm install nodemon. So anyway, going back to this, let's see if this works now. Let me drag this up here and then send it. And then there we go. We got our error, not long enough. And if we refresh the page, this is the old one, and it didn't submit the new one. So there we go. We just blockaded our backend to make it a little bit more secure. And that's pretty much it. If you want to dive into this further, we might touch upon this later when we talk about Mongo, but there's a tool called Mongoose, which lets you define your schema for your database. Right now, we're not using a schema. We're just inserting random JSON documents into our database. But I'm going to show you Mongoose, which not only defines what fields you're going to insert, but it lets you define, for example, the length of a text field. So you don't need to do all these little JavaScript things to make sure everything's proper. It'll automatically do that for you and throw you it'll throw you an error automatically when you try to insert a document. Using something like this code over here, you'll insert a document, it'll throw an error automatically without you having to type out all this error checking code, just because you specified all that stuff. That's the back end. And on the front end, there's also some tools. So if you Google something like Angular form validation, there's tons of stuff out there for doing this kind of thing, including the official Angular docs. So let's see here. ng model. So there's some CSS classes you can do, like ng valid. So you can use. How should I demonstrate this? Yeah. So if you have a form in Angular with a form name, like this one, name equals form, also in your HTML, you can do something like form dot $error. So it makes like an error message show up if there's an error on the form. So there's different ways you can go about it. I encourage you to try out one of these Angular form validation tutorials out there. There's a lot out there. There's many different ways you can do it. There's something called ng messages. There's a bunch of different Angular directives that help you with it. And there's also some custom directives that people made for doing this kind of thing. But one last thing is, you may be asking yourself, why bother with front-end validation if I could just validate all the data coming in on my back end no matter what? Well, it comes down to a couple things. Like if you have a high traffic website, you don't want a lot of extraneous random bad requests coming into your server that otherwise don't need to. Like for example, google.com has, I'm sure, millions of requests per minute. If you don't type anything in the text field and you hit submit, you don't want that going to the server, because that could possibly double their server load, which could get very expensive. So they definitely want some front-end validation to make sure you filled out that text box. If you don't have a high volume server, which you probably don't, because I don't know, I just have a feeling, you probably want to do front-end validation because just for user experience, it's just better if they don't have to wait to submit their data to the server before they get an error message. With Angular validation, you type A and it doesn't let you submit it, it's instant. You don't have to wait for it to hit the server to get back that error rejection. So just some things to consider. In general, you always want to do front end and back end validation, and there's a lot of different ways for doing so. You can just Google those ways and do some tutorials, but here's a simple way to do it that I just showed you. So hope you enjoy.